and Yuri Garidnichenko for inviting me to be part of this great event. So today I'll talk about what has happened to the judiciary since Euromaidan, since the momentous changes of 2014. And I'll try to get you introduced to some of the changes, and also to try to get a sense of what has changed, because in fact the judicial reform was one of the top concerns of the protesters. Getting a fairer judiciary and going towards the rule of law was very important. So what has happened in the meantime? What I'm going to focus on is the executive-judicial relationship after the end of the protest. Maybe I'll sit, actually, because I see this better. So there are several options in which the executive-judicial relationship can play out. First, the judiciary, after this tremendous change in the political incumbency, could simply pledge loyalty to the new incumbent. Alternatively, they could actively oppose the new incumbent, or they could try to pull out of politics altogether and sort of try to be, it may be safer on the sidelines of such momentous political change. The government, alternatively, or the new political incumbents, I'm using the term government actually quite loosely, not as the cabinet of ministers, but the new political incumbents also have several options. They can try to seek support from existing judicial elites, from the Yanukovych-era judicial elites, basically. They could try to replace them with new judicial elites, or they could also attempt to insulate the judiciary from politics, to sort of leave it be for a certain amount of time and pursue sort of non-political reforms within the judiciary. There are several plausible outcomes out of the combination of these strategies that both the judiciary and the government could adopt. The first and normatively most desirable outcome is actually a bona fide judicial reform that is aimed at creating a politically independent and non-corrupt judiciary, something that Ukraine has not had in the post-Soviet period, and something that has been, again, at the top of Euromaidan demands. Another option is to simply replace the existing judicial elites that were close to Yanukovych during his tenure with judicial elites that are close to the new political incumbents, and basically continue the parasitic or symbiotic ties between judicial elites and political incumbents. This option would entail sort of a pledge of allegiance from, this option would entail the replacement of judicial elites. The third option is that existing judicial elites may actually try to convert into supporters of the new regime. And when they try to, and the new political incumbents may actually pursue this strategy as well. And what that would do, that would require sort of a pledge of allegiance, some evidence of this transformation, a pledge of allegiance from the existing judicial elites to the new government. And the final plausible option is sort of a digging in by the existing judicial elites. And here I've said Yanukovych era, but in fact they are they existed for a longer period than just the Yanukovych era. This is not simply about Yanukovych supporters in the or party of region appointees in the judiciary. It's a longer sort of post-Soviet core set of judicial elites that had been in power power within the judiciary for a long time. Now, they can try to, by not pledging allegiance to the new government and by resisting any attempts at bona fide judicial reform, they could basically aim to transform the judiciary into a politically independent institution. That would be a change from the tendency so far, but still a corrupt institution, since they will not have any incentive to pursue reforms that are needed to enhance confidence in the judiciary from the public. Then, if they have this politically independent institution, but unreformed one, they can continue to reap the benefits of judicial corruption rents without catering also to politicians' preferences, which they had to do before. Now, it seems that what has happened in the last year has been a combination of either options 1 and 4 or options 2 and 4. They're in fact co-occurring. So what we have observed over the past year, for any of you who have followed judicial developments, has been an intense executive judicial confrontation. Basically, the political incumbents have tried, starting immediately from the spring, to dislodge existing judicial elites, and there has been a lot of pushback and resistance. Now, oh, sorry. Where do I point this? Okay. Okay. So I'm not actually going to go over the executive judicial confrontation very extensively because in this Ukrainian audience, I think you're probably familiar with what has been happening. Basically, to quickly summarize events in judicial reform, in March, so almost immediately after the government changed, the new government passed a law on increasing trust in the judiciary, which is more widely known as the Judicial Lustration law. And that law did two things. It basically summarily fired all the administrative leaders within the institutions that govern the judiciary, the High Council of Justice, the High Qualification Commission for Judges, and mandated the re-election of members to these commissions. And it also mandated it fired all chairs of courts across the country and mandated that judicial courts, basically all the judges on each court, should hold an election to elect for the first time their own administrative leader, their court chair. Up until 2014, court chairs, which is a very powerful position, I'll talk about this in a second, court chairs were either appointed by the president, by the Council of Justice, by the High Council of Justice or the Council of Judges. Alternatively, the ways of appointing court chairs changed over the years many times, but they were never directly elected from among their peers, which is the momentous change of April 2014 and of this law on increasing trust in the judiciary. That law mandated that all the courts across the country, at all levels of the judicial hierarchy, and in all three judicial hierarchies, the administrative courts, the economic courts, and the courts of general jurisdiction, should hold elections to select new court chairs from among the judges serving on the court. Now, why are court chairs so important? Well, the short answer is because internal judicial independence in the Ukrainian judiciary has been traditionally very low. This is not simply a feature of the Ukrainian judiciary; it's a feature of all the post-Soviet judiciaries. Also, actually, to some extent, a feature of the fact that Ukraine has a civil law system as opposed to a common law system. So, what that means is that individual judges are constrained in their decision-making by the upper court as well as by their administrative superiors. So there's, by low internal judicial independence, I mean that judges are basically, they have to answer to their superiors within the judicial hierarchy. And the court chairs were the main conduits of this strong hierarchical relationship. Although their position was supposed to be mostly administrative, on paper, the occupant of the court chair position should be sort of a primus inter pares. In reality, court chairs have traditionally been very powerful figures. They control the distribution of cases, which means that they can give particularly tricky and cases that everybody wants to avoid to the judge, to a judge that they don't like for whatever reason. They can exercise pressure on judges this way. They control salary bonuses. Judges are also, if they don't have their own apartments, entitled to receive accommodation from the court, and the court chairs control that allocation as well. So they have very significant leverage over their colleagues. This has been well documented in the literature on post-Soviet judiciaries. So, given that court chairs are so important, it makes sense to look at what happened to the court chairs when they faced this election in April 2014, which I'll call a retention election, because basically they had the option of being reelected to their position. In many instances, in fact, they ran unopposed. You know, they could be either reelected to their positions or they could lose their positions. So the media has widely reported this figure, that roughly about 80% of court chairs retained their positions in the April 2014 elections. And the figure is accurate. I now have the full data on actually who lost this retention election and who won it, and the figure is accurate. But the point of this presentation and of this paper today is to actually get into this figure, to know exactly who are the people who managed to save their positions and get reelected, and who are these 20% who lost the elections. So, in order to do that, to begin answering these questions, I have collected the full information on the outcomes of these of these judicial elections in Ukraine's 728 courts. So in addition to the outcome of the election, I have information about the individuals who held those positions, as well as the individuals who were elected in who replaced them in the 20% of the cases. But the interesting part is that I have information on when the court chairs were first appointed to the court that they chaired, when was their last appointment as most recent appointment as chair before the 2014 election. I have information on the size of the courts, where the courts are located regionally, of course, and also where they're located in the hierarchy. So from the information about the courts, we also roughly know the political importance of each court, which is also important. So let me show you some data on the individuals who served as chairs and faced in April 2014 and faced faced the retention elections. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate two documents here. So the first graph here shows you how many years the judge who was chair in 2014 served on this court. You see that it's roughly normally distributed, but the interesting part, which makes sense, of course, is that there are more people who have served fewer years because at the higher levels of the judiciary, people are appointed towards the end of their career, so they haven't had time to serve on these courts for a really long time. So that's why it's shaped like that. The more interesting variation here is that from the variable of when the judge was first appointed to the court that they chaired in 2014, we have data on the distribution of judges by the year in which they entered the judiciary. And we see that some of the claims that the Ukrainian judiciary is dominated by Soviet-era appointees are not exactly right. Soviet-era appointees are about 23% of the judicial corps among the chairs. That percent is probably a bit higher because here we have the date when they were first appointed to the court that they chaired. So for the people at the higher echelons, they probably entered the judiciary way before they were appointed to that court. But given that the higher echelons of the judiciary are a small proportion of the overall judiciary, it still seems that the Soviet-era appointee figure is well under half. So we can't really say that the judiciary is dominated by old guys who've been serving since Soviet days. It's also probably interesting to note that Kuchma appointees are the biggest proportion of the judicial corps. It makes sense temporarily, and that Yushchenko and Yanukovych appointees are of roughly equal size. In terms of gender breakdown, there's we usually talk about how the post-Soviet judiciaries have a lot of women represented on them. Well, once you even start you start here with the court chair positions, and at the district courts, they are well represented. But as you see, that number dramatically tapers off as you go higher in the judicial hierarchy. There are fewer women at the appellate courts and no women chairing the high courts. But what a particularly interesting set of variables that come from this data set are these breakdown by political ties. Obviously there's no direct measure for that, but I'll explain to you how I've tried to proxy for that. The first category that I've identified is people who, among the court chairs, who are political proteges of a certain of a certain incumbent at some point. Now, how do I identify this? When you look at when judges were first appointed to the court that they chaired and when they were appointed to chair that court, you see that about 11% of the sample are appointed to a court and then immediately appointed chair, literally within a couple of months. Now, that is a strong signal that these are political appointees. It's a strong signal that they're political appointees because normally the process of appointing a judge to a court in the first place is very cumbersome. It has to go through several different hoops. So very often judges, when they're first appointed to a court, they serve in this temporary capacity for quite a while until all of their documents go through and they can take the oath of office. Now, the next appointment to chair the court also has to go through several stages and takes a long time. So if somebody is literally rammed through this institutional process very quickly, and especially given that they don't actually have, they haven't had the time to develop ties on this court, to develop a reputation among their peers. The fact that they're appointed chair almost immediately after they join the court is a strong signal of strong political connections. And we see that about 11% of all the court chairs were in this political protege category. 3/4 of them are Yanukovych appointees. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Yanukovych was particularly bad, worse at this than other presidents before him. He might well have been, but that data cannot really tell us that, because it is possible that the Yushchenko proteges were simply replaced by Yanukovych proteges. There are some, so out of the, so three-quarters of them are Yanukovych appointees. The remaining quarter are indeed were appointed by Yushchenko, and a few of them by Kuchma. So we have that variable, which I think is quite interesting, because we want to see how these people did in the elections in April 2014. The other variable is what I call political conformists among the court chairs. Now, these are people who served multiple terms as chairs under different administrations. And from my research, from my previous research on the Ukrainian judiciary, it is quite clear that to be in the the court chair position, you have to be able to work with the party, with the government in power. So I'm calling them political conformists because they managed to get themselves appointed to the court chair position more than once. Now, the court chair, I didn't mention this before, but court chairs are appointed to 5-year terms. So you have to get reappointed if you want to be chair longer than that. And about 41% of the sample were indeed reappointed several times to the chair position. Now, it doesn't mean that they were, I don't necessarily use political conformists here as a negative connotation and as a judgment on their competence as judges. They may have been very good judges and very good administrative leaders. The point is that they probably worked well with the political incumbents of different stripes. So 40% of the chairs are in this category. Now, what happened in the April 2014 elections? The aggregate rate indeed is about 80%. I don't actually have a graph for it, but the first thing that I tried to see was whether there were differences in the retention rates by region. And from this graph, it looks like there might be a difference that so the red bars are the proportion of people who lost their positions in the retention election. So that figure is the highest in the center. But we have to keep in mind also that the center region also has the highest concentration of politically important courts. So we don't know if this is about region or about political importance, which is why at the end I'll arrive at a model that tries to take all the variables and put them together to get their relative importance. But this is the this is just the descriptive data. At the different judicial hierarchies, there is a significant, well, what looks like a significant difference in retention rates as well. And the courts of general jurisdiction have an above average rate of re-election, whereas the administrative and the economic courts, the two other hierarchies, have a much higher proportion of judges who lost, of chairs who lost their positions. The thing to keep in mind there is that there are fewer courts, both in the administrative, a lot fewer, in the administrative and in the economic hierarchy. So you replace 2 additional people and it changes the percent dramatically. So we can't really make any conclusions based on this descriptive data. How about retention rates at different at politically important courts and courts that are less politically relevant? What do I mean by that? I've actually, what I mean by that is that some courts, by virtue of their position in the judicial hierarchy or by virtue of their geographic position, receive cases that tend to be a lot more politically consequential. In other words, it matters if you're the chair of Pechersky Sud in Kiev versus the chair of a village court in Khersonskaya Oblast. So the political stakes of the cases that you hear are much higher. So what I wanted to check is whether there may be a difference in the retention rates at politically important courts versus the other courts. And as politically important courts, I identified all the courts in the administrative and economic hierarchies, all the appellate courts, all the high courts, and the biggest courts in each of the main cities in the oblast. So about 120, I think, courts out of the 720 are identified as politically important. And you see that from this simple descriptive data, it seems that they have a higher percentage, that the politically important courts have a higher percentage of chair replacement than the politically unimportant courts. And finally, what about these people that I had identified as political proteges, these people who were immediately, who were appointed to a court and immediately appointed chairs? Well, they have the highest loss, electoral loss rate of all the groups that I've been looking at. About 40% of those lost their positions in the elections. Now, once you put all of this into, wow, these are terribly small numbers, sorry. But once you put all of this into a multivariate model of re-election, we see several things come out, several conclusions come out of it. The first one is that proteges were indeed more likely to lose their positions when you control for the region in which they served, the type of court, the level of the court, the size of the court, and the period which they served, the length of their judicial tenure. Controlling for all of these things, protege status is highly significant in all the models that in the different model specifications that I tried. Another finding, which I have no explanation for, but is very robust, is that women were more likely to lose their positions, all else equal, at all the courts. So they were significantly disadvantaged in these elections. A third interesting finding from the different models is that district courts have a higher retention rate, and it is statistically significant, but until it's statistically significant only until you incorporate the size of the court into the model. Once you control for size, the district level court variable loses significance, and the coefficient becomes way smaller. So the point is that the reason the district courts have higher retention rates is more likely to have to do with the fact that a lot of these courts have 3-4 judges on them. So there's maybe only one candidate that's suitable to be chair. I mean, it's much easier, it's much harder to replace the and to have an election, competitive election, when you have 4 people serving on that court. So it seems to have more to do with size than with anything about the district courts. It's also interesting that there is no regional dimension. None of the regional variables are significant in any of the models. There is also no difference among the judicial hierarchies. So when you control for things like the political importance of the court, and well, that is not relevant to the hierarchies, but when you control for a region, for the existence of a protege in that court, in fact, there's no difference among the judicial hierarchies. The political conformists, the people who served multiple terms, have held on. They have the same high retention rate as their position, political conformists are neither more or less likely to be replaced in that judicial election. So I think the overall conclusion from this is that there has been a little bit more change than the 80% re-election figure actually belies, because we know that from among these 20% who were replaced, they're disproportionately people who were appointed for political reasons to the courts that they were appointed to. The protege status is really a very strong indicator that you're likely to lose your position. Now, the reasons for this can be different. It could be that the government is basically winning some of these fights to replace judicial elites at the top of the judicial hierarchy, but it could be also, and this is something that I plan to look into in more detail in further iterations of this paper, but it could be related to involvement of civil society monitoring groups in those elections. In other words, it's possible that civil society organizations such as the Lustration Committee were aware that there are certain courts that are headed by people with strong political connections who were sort of parachuted into these courts. And it is more likely that they would have gone and picketed. You probably saw in the media that there were instances in which civil society activists actively disrupted these judicial elections and try to block the re-election of the previous chair. It could be that this happened more in the case of these proteges, in which case this figure may be evidence that the civil society monitoring project of judicial reform has had tangible effects. I mean, whether we think that this is the way in which the judiciary should be governed by activists going to judicial elections is a different question, but empirically we may actually have some evidence here that this is making a difference. Okay, I think I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And now we have comments from Taras Kuzio from University of Alberta, who will discuss this paper a little bit.
Okay. Перший мікрофон. This is a very difficult subject to comment on, not because the paper isn't good. I think it's a fantastic paper, but it's obviously on a very specific area, on a very kind of narrow topic, an important narrow topic, and it's in an area of studies of Ukraine that's hardly undertaken by any political scientists in the West. I mean, there are very, very few people writing about the rule of law and judicial process in American and European political science. So it's important from that point of view. And I can't really fault anything in the paper in terms of its methodology. It's really something, I would say, above my pay grade. So I'll try to put it into a bit of a broader context and maybe to try and maybe expand this very interesting information into sort of areas that probably more people in the room will try to understand. First of all, what I think is important if we look at the last sort of 10, 15 years of Ukrainian history, it's interesting to see how the rule of law was actually less important to pro-Western Democrats than to the Donetsk clan. Surprising. Viktor Yushchenko didn't seem to care very much, although he was pro-NATO, pro-EU membership, didn't seem to care very much about the rule of law. He intervened in the judicial process. He undertook himself an illegal decision to disband parliament in 2007, unconstitutional decision. And he seemed to be very blasé about who was in charge of the prosecutor's office. At the same time, the Donetsk clan were very interested in the rule of law. Not because they supported the rule of law, of course, but because they wanted to control the judicial process. And for half of Ukraine's history, since 1991, the Donetsk clan has controlled the prosecutor's office. We tend to forget that. So 2002 to 2014. So they did see that as extremely important as part of their attempt to monopolize political and economic life. So what this meant was that there was a disconnect between foreign policy goals of European integration, of NATO membership, and domestic policies, which were especially evident under Viktor Yushchenko, and especially in the areas of rule of law and fighting corruption. Hopefully today, now, with the reforms that we've heard about, with the changes taking place in Ukraine, that the gap, the lack of interaction between domestic policies and foreign policy goals is now narrowed or is now been integrated. When you talk about, and I quote, fair, clean, the Euromaidan supported fair, clean and independent judiciary, I think you need to qualify that in the paper a bit more, I would say, because I'm not sure that's completely true. I don't think the average person on the Euromaidan thought about the judiciary. They thought about it in more abstract terms. And let's remember, it began with the refusal to sign the association agreement, which was then very quickly overtaken by anti-corruption issues and especially national identity issues. So judicial issues were, I think, in there somewhere, but they were, I think, far broader than the paper here. So, I mean, it's obviously there, but in terms of rule of law or how the state responds and relates to citizens, instead of being treated as subjects, as in Eurasia, as in the Soviet Union, as in Tsarist Russia, people demanded in the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan to be treated as European or North American citizens. So obviously the rule of law is part and parcel of that, but they demanded a new contract, or sorry, not a new contract, the beginning of a contract between themselves and rulers, which we have in most democracies. The other question, I think, which is interesting, you talk about, ties between politicians and judges, which of course is fascinating, and it obviously mirrors ties or the nexus between business and politics. And you can't really divorce the two, judges and politicians and politics and business. It's probably an interaction between all of those groups. And let's remember that that interaction or that nexus between business and politics remains extremely strong to this day. President Petro Poroshenko, after all, went to seek advice about his election with Mr. Firtash in Vienna, who's waiting extradition to the US on criminal charges. 3 of the 6 factions in the Ukrainian parliament are linked in many ways to the gas lobby. The Prime Minister of Ukraine likes to flirt with oligarchs, Mr. Kolomoisky, Mr. Akhmetov. But more importantly, as I mentioned in the previous panel, there are no political parties in Ukraine. So therefore, as long as the parties in Ukraine remain virtual, I think that will also influence the degree to which there will be ties between business and politics. Because, of course, oligarchs and big business are very good at creating virtual parties, or Tymchasovi parties, you know, parties just used for one election. I think also towards this question, the influence of political parties on reform of the judiciary. It's fascinating in Ukraine that you would think it would be the opposite, but it's not. It's not the younger prime minister, Yatsenyuk, who is pushing for foreigners, for Westerners to be in the government. It's actually President Poroshenko. Yet Mr. Yatsenyuk is actually not very much in favor of them because they are potential competition for him. To what degree is there support within different branches for the new National Anti-Corruption Bureau? Again, there was initially some foreign candidates for the head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, but they were removed for many reasons, but one of them was really opposition from the government as opposed to the president who supported having a foreigner as head. And even though we had a Euromaidan, which was in part in support of rule of law, a new contract being developed between the state and citizens, the president who was elected nevertheless still chose a terrible prosecutor general. Was he not listening to the crowds? If it was so important to the crowds, why did President Poroshenko select Mr. Yerema? And is his successor any better? You know, I'll lay out a claim, shall we say, that if nobody is put in jail from Ukraine's elites, either for massive corruption under Yanukovych or for the murder of Euromaidan protesters, by the end of this year, then President Poroshenko is in deep trouble. It seems that in Ukraine, crime pays. If you're at the senior level, of course, because nobody goes to jail, unless they foolishly infringe American legislation or seek asylum in the US. Then they do go to jail, or maybe go to jail. If you're not a member of the Ukrainian elites, of course, then the conviction rate used to be 99%, which I think has gone down to 80% or so. So there's some progress. But this is a country that, at least until today, and we're talking about a year after the Euromaidan, crime pays. Nobody's gone to jail. The chief of staff of Viktor Yanukovych is a member of the Ukrainian parliament. So if Viktor Yanukovych is a criminal, I wonder why the chief of staff is not. So there is, I think, these changes are very important, but are they too slow for the public, and will they damage the popularity of a president, which is dangerous? You know, it was different when it was a declining popularity for Viktor Yushchenko, but far more dangerous today when Ukraine's at war with Russia. The last thing you want is a president who doesn't have much legitimacy or much popularity. And to give one example of, maybe you can comment on this, one example of the slowness of change is that, from what I understand, there are still 12 of the 17 Constitutional Court judges remain from the Yanukovych era. And this is the time when Ukraine is allegedly investigating the usurping of power by the Constitutional Court, which agreed to the constitutional changes in 2010, making Ukraine move from a parliamentary to a presidential system. By the way, I thought the opposition under Yanukovych called for the closing of the Constitutional Court, so they've obviously changed their mind there. Also, it'd be interesting for you to maybe comment about political conformists. It seems to me out of all these they're the most interesting in some ways. Do we have the same kind of phenomena in the West, in Western courts? I mean, are these just people who, you know, are pretty normal judges, but so don't really have an ideological swing to kind of hammer to bear, as it were? Are they going to be more in favor of change? Are they going to just mimic reforms? Are they going to block reforms? I mean, it'd be interesting for you to speculate on that. On that note, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thanks, Taras, for the comments. I think broadening the argument and bringing in the context is definitely the next step for this paper. In terms of the change being slow and the constitutional court judges still being on it, it's a tough trade-off. The same actually also with putting people in jail, because given the track record of putting people in jail for corruption crimes with the Tymoshenko case, it really is a tough thing to do now, because you don't want to be accused by, or I'm sure there is some concern that you want to make this prosecution as whatever, yeah, it has to hold water this time. So that's one of the trade-offs, and the other trade-off is concerns the again the Constitutional Court, that you don't want to be seen summarily replacing all of everyone in these positions, because it is that also doesn't look very good for the long-term prospects of the rule of law. But I think there definitely is a process right now going on of a tug of war between the new political incumbents and some of the entrenched judicial elites, where they're trying to sabotage any attempt either at real reforms or at simply being replaced and continuing things as usual. So we'll see how it's going to play out over the next year.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from the audience. I think Eric was first. I
came here from Tbilisi, Georgia, and I would like to comment from the specifically Georgian perspective. We had a couple of judicial reforms in the last 15 years. And the first round of these reforms was basically about replacing the whole judiciary, and not only judiciary, the prosecution system. Everybody were replaced. There was a total, complete lustration, as you call. This is the last thing you want to do if you want to have an independent judiciary and a professional prosecution system. We had a system in the last many years which rubber-stamped the prosecution recommendations, and we had a conviction rate of 99% in courts. This was a major disaster, and we paid the price for it. What I heard from your presentation is that I don't see any evidence for that happening in Ukraine. The fact that you have this so-called political conformist staying in office seems like a pretty good sign. Maybe you should pick a better name for this category of people. Conformism is not exactly a flattery, yeah. You know, when you are staying in office with so many administrations changing, it probably means that you don't do anything atrocious. So whenever the administration changes, they are okay with you staying right there. So acrobats, or maybe just professional people. The other small point is when you make appointments, and now this is a point about the political appointees. When you make appointments, there's always a trade-off between professionalism and loyalty. So it may be that you appoint, you push through, or you use the expression ram through the guys who are loyal to you, but maybe they're just professionally incompetent, and therefore they get replaced not as a result of pressure from the outside, because there isn't maybe. It's such a decentralized process. Probably just bad administrators, that their colleagues don't like them. As simple as that.
No, these are excellent points. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but he was first. Oh. This one go? Sorry. I I don't know why they're not working.
So I'm not sure I picked up everything, but I had like 3 parts to a question. One was very close to what the other Eric said. So clearly, you're trying to seek some kind of balance in illustration. You know, where are the, you know, what is the, you want some illustration, but you probably don't want to go all the way as you did in Georgia. So the question is, how can you establish that balance? And I think that Eric's question is about that. The second question, it was related to, you know, the outcome of this. Can you say a little bit about these elections? Were there secret ballots? Were there multiple candidates? You know, what kind of campaigns? You know, what kind of information? How, you know, how did it happen? Because I think it is important in order to understand. And the final thing was, you know, so when you think about sort of what is the optimal extent of lustration, you know, the sort of alternative approach is to try to build for the future. You know, you do civil service reform. You try to change the way that people will be appointed in the future, the way they're trained, and so on. To what extent was that a component of these reforms?
Thanks. First, on how the elections were held, there was actually very little time to prepare for these elections. Basically, the law is passed in late March, and the first week of April, judges have to get together and elect a new chair. So literally, was no time for campaigning. They are a secret ballot, and all judges on the court get to vote on who the next chair will be, because the law stops the basically fires the existing chair. Now, I did look at how many candidates there were in those elections. I actually don't have the full data on that, but from the sample of courts that did respond with that information, the smaller courts very often had just the same chair run again unopposed. The bigger courts usually had 2, sometimes 3 candidates for the position. There were also a few cases in which the chair who had just been fired by the law simply did not run. So there's a brand new set of candidates for the chair position. So there it's not even a retention issue. There are a few of those, though. They're not out of the 20% who lose their positions, is not a very big proportion of that. In terms of the sort of the optimal extent of lustration, I think what's particularly important in this initial stage for the development of the judiciary is to give the judiciary breathing room to reform itself with the help, pressure maybe of both civil society and the new government. But what I mean by breathing room is actually to take the judiciary as much as possible out of really hotly contested political cases that have really important political ramifications. Because right now, as lustration and change, rejuvenation, or whatever you want to call it, of the judiciary is supposed to be going on, this process is only complicated by the fact that the judiciary has to now deal with political hot potatoes. So I think that makes it additionally complicated. But I do agree that full lustration is a really bad precedent for the long-term development of an independent judiciary, which should be the goal here. At the same time, the question is that some change has to happen, otherwise things will continue running as usual. So maybe this core 40% of people who have survived different administrations is the the core group to look to. Although at the same time, they're also the most versed in how to deal with politicians and how to get what you want from politicians and what to give them in exchange. So that's also a problematic group. So unfortunately, I don't really have a great policy recommendation on where to draw the line, except to point out that there really should be an attempt to insulate the judiciary out from politics right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time now, and